Hello, everybody, and welcome to all of you to this webinar, Gendered Book and Reading Cultures. My name is Marianne Kartzow, and I'm Professor of New Testament Studies at the University of Oslo here in Norway. Together with Liv Ingeborg, I share this academic year the project Books Known Only by Title, Exploring the Gendered Structures of the First Millennium Imagined Library at the Center of Advanced Studies, CAS, at the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. And it is a great honor to chair this panel and to see the very long list of people from all over the world among the audience. Welcome and good to see you. We can greet each other good morning, good evening, and good midnight. But for now, I want to greet all of you by wishing you a 5 quarters stimulating and inspiring webinar. Our research project is now halfway in our webinar series, and I will now present today's panel and the topic. This time it was really far too tempting not to let the order of the panelists come alphabetically, simply because we, by coincidence, have presentations from scholars starting their names with A, B, C, and D. So on our panel, we have, first out is Mika, Ahuvia, and she's Assistant Professor of Classical Judaism at the University of Washington. And then Esther Brownsmith, postdoctoral researcher, Center for Advanced Study, and MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. She's here in Oslo. Elizabeth Castelli, professor at the Religion Department at Barnard College in New York. And Ismo Dunderberg, professor of New Testament Studies at the University of Helsinki. And he's also currently a fellow here at CAS. And now a few words of introduction to our topic. In the webinar today, we ask, what can we know about ancient book and reading cultures? How can gender theories and other critical approaches help us ask new questions of ancient texts, whether we focus on their contents, their reception history, or their scholarship, this discussion in scholarship? The webinar will employ a variety of perspectives to search for alternative ways of thinking about book cultures, with an eye for gendered power structures in portrayals of authorship, attribution, preservation, and transmission. We will critically examine how gender has shaped our ideas about the First Millennium Library. In light of recent studies on the sociology of reading in antiquity, we will explore what role are ascribed to texts and interpretive communities in literary portraits such as early Christian Gospels and apologetic works. The panel will explore the many questions that arise from these subjects. On what grounds do we know anything about who wrote, copied, read, or heard the text we study? If books are gendered male, as is the authoritative line of textual transmission, how can we conceptualize exceptions from these structures? What are the implications of claiming female authorship of various ancient books? In what way do women, as historical persons who contributed to book production, transmission, and reception, relate to the female characters construed in texts? Female characters tend to be associated with contested, apocryphal, or heretic books, often books known only by title. But this is not always the case. And what can the examples tell? In order to identify gaps in the current discourse, this webinar will pay attention to women, but also think beyond gender binaries, drawing from intersectionality, masculinity theories, queer theories, and post-colonial perspectives. These tools and beyond can help the Academy critically examine what shaped the imagination of the First Millennium Library. Now, before we shall listen to the first panelist, I would like to give the word to another fellow here at CAS, Francis Burkhardt, who is Associate Professor at the Lutheran Theological Seminar in Hong Kong, but currently here on place in Oslo. And he will give you some instructions related to the discussion following after the panel for you to prepare your comments and questions. Francis.
Thank you, Marianne. So I just want to remind everyone that this is a webinar, a Zoom webinar, which most of you, I think, have used before, but maybe some of you haven't. What a webinar is it means that you can see us presenting up here, but we can't see or hear you. So when you ask questions, we'd like you to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom dashboard for entering questions for all of our speakers. During the question period, I will read out the questions sent through the Q&A feature, after which the speakers will answer the questions. An additional note is that today's session is being recorded, so we will be posting this later. It is also currently being live streamed on Facebook at the link provided in the chat. Back to you, Marianne.
Thank you so much. Good. Okay, so then let's get started with the panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Mika, Ahuvia, and she will talk about possible approaches to evidences of women as cultural producers in Jewish antiquity. Mika.
Thank you. And I do want to begin by thanking the Center for Advanced Study in Oslo for providing such a wonderful intellectual community. It's so rare to have the time and space to think about methodology, historiography, and feminist insights in an ongoing way for months with such wonderful conversation partners. So in this brief presentation, I want to share some insights that I've gained from thinking with this group and my current reflections on the gender dynamics of pre-modern scribal cultures. I think we must reimagine literacy, reading and writing in antiquity in terms of spaces inhabited by people of divergent gender, class, and maybe even ethnic status. To give a concrete example of a problem I've been struggling with, how do we handle the small sample of Babylonian incantation texts that are written in the first person singular feminine? While a couple of scholars of religious studies like Rebecca Lessis and Michael D. Swartz have long acknowledged that it's possible some ritual practitioners were women, I think the field of ancient Jewish magic as a whole has been resistant to the idea that a few women might have written these words, upholding a kind of a literate-illiterate binary instead, or a sage-disciple model for knowledge transmission among ritual practitioners. In a recent article titled, "Who Were the Jewish Magicians Behind the Aramaic Incantation Bowls?" Avigail Mannequin-Bamberger summarizes this perspective, but also puts forward compelling evidence that the practitioners behind incantation bowls were professional scribes. She explains the first person singular feminine in the incantation was, and I quote, "just a magical technique in which the client of the bowl is listed in this way." Another quote, "Most such bowls switch back to the regular third person singular. This first person introduction is formulaic or just a more general imitation of the Jewish divorce document." I'm kind of quoting from all over her article there. So in other words, when we see this first person singular feminine, it's just imitation or formulaic, it's just listing, it's not evidence for Jewish women's religiosity and certainly not for their voice. I think another reading is possible. In Jewish studies, I think the default, safe or rigorous position has been that we can only recover men's cultural production, whatever was transmitted by rabbinic institutions. Now, recent scholarship has made it clear that rabbinic Judaism was marginal in Jewish communities, at least until the 10th century. And rabbinic consolidation of authority was a gendered struggle. As Eve Krakowski has demonstrated in her essay, Maimonides' Menstrual Reform in Egypt, the rabbinic Jewish elite in Cairo consolidated their authority in part by wresting legal privileges of inheritance away from women who did not abide by their interpretation of purity law. Another medievalist named Joel Kramer noted 20 years ago that every medieval society from England to China has examples of women writers and women as transmitters of texts. That is every society except medieval Jewish society. Now, this may be because of Jewish women's kind of doubled disempowerment, right, both as Jews in Islamic or Christian societies and as women. But of course, Jewish women of various walks of life lived nonetheless, right, apart and within rabbinic dorms, exercising various levels of privileges depending on their familial status, their enslaved or free status, married, widowed, orphaned, independently wealthy, and all of them have left traces of their lives that are still being uncovered. The exclusion of women from the imagination of the Jewish past is, I think, just another iteration of the fantasy of the exclusively male subject of historical truth, as Bonnie Smith terms it in The Gender of History. Thinking about the gender dynamics of scribal culture in antiquity can help us move away from that fantasy. I also want to heed Esther Fuchs's searing criticism of Jewish women's studies directly. She urges scholars to stop equating Judaism with rabbinic Judaism, stop equating women with rabbinic representation of women, stop deploying essentialist definition of women, avoid over-representing European Judaism, and stop celebrating the success of a few women over the struggles of many other women. So I've been thinking about all of that as I wrote this presentation. To think about pre-modern Jewish scribal culture in a fresh way, I turned to the research of Geniza studies scholars. The Geniza, in case you don't know, is a synagogue storage room of discarded texts preserved by the dry Egyptian climate. It sheds light on almost 1,000 years of Jewish life. The evidence still being uncovered by Geniza studies scholars is crucial to destabilizing the way we conceptualize writing in antiquity, especially as the provenance of a single male professional or the lone male scribe or as a monk taking down dictation. So to get at the gender dynamics of pre-modern scribal culture, I want to bring in hopefully soon to be published research by Geniza studies scholar Oded Zinger, who is here. Right now, his arguments exist only in podcast form, and I do want to share the link with you really quickly. Okay, there you go. It's in the chat. He promised me this will be in a forthcoming article. So I'm going to summarize his argument and Oded chime in if I get this wrong. So the world of Geniza texts sheds light on a time when most writing occurred through dictation. Conversing took place through dictation to scribes and recitation of letters by scribes. So far, 200 letters composed by women have been identified. Zinger argues that women's letters were a pervasive phenomenon. Writing played a role in women's lives, whether they knew how to write or not. Men and women of various classes used scribes to write letters. As Zinger points out, all letters are dictations, and he reminds us that many learned medieval treatises themselves were dictations to students. In pre-modernity, dictating is writing. So Zinger asserts that authorship is socially constructed, right? There's no such thing as unmediated, unaffected voice from antiquity. Since scholars' kind of desire to recover voices is so ingrained, we seek unmediated voices, but writing, like talking, is culturally constructed mode of communication. So when we think about ancient correspondence, we have to remember there's always the third party of the scribe. And there's also the fourth party because letters were often circulated for an audience. Even when crafted intimately, letters have a public audience. And this is the part of Zinger's arguments that I found most electrifying. Women in antiquity considered the dictation of their letter as their writing. He notes that women state in their letters, "I wrote you 2 letters," right? They're referring to their dictation as writing. Zinger notes that another woman says she enjoys writing because it's like speaking to the addressee directly. So if women consider their dictation their own writing, why don't we as scholars today? Why are we holding ancient people to our standards of authorship? And, sure, a lot of ancient letters, right, are built up of formulas, just like ritual magical texts. But again, to quote Zinger's, formulas aren't necessarily inauthentic. We also use formulas. It doesn't empty gestures of their respect or their meaning, end quote. So what does this mean for the study of ancient ritual texts and other ancient composition? I think the scribal culture of medieval Egypt has much in common with the scribal culture of late antique Babylonia. As Mannequin Bamberger points out, right, in one bull, when ritual practitioners refer to other practitioners, they call them those who write books, who sit in the marketplaces and the streets, and who go out on the road, end quote. But then they rail against those practitioners speaking, their mouths being open and speaking evil words, right? So they criticize the scribes for speaking, not for writing. And I think it's because they conceptualize writing as speaking. Scholars of Jewish studies have long been mystified by why rabbinic literature doesn't refer to the writing of incantation bowls. And I think it's because rabbinic literature is full of references to speaking, right, to adjuring and saying things out loud, not to writing, because writing is always speaking. So for every text produced by a scribe, I imagine a really dynamic compositional environment with at least two people. And I think we can look for evidence of inclusion and exclusion of perspectives based on gender or religious preference, class status. Dictation and reading happened out loud with an audience in public or shared spaces composed of family, servants, the enslaved. So when I'm going to treat dictation as writing and speaking, reading as hearing something read aloud, just as pre-modern people did. And I think that Zinger's insights can really open up the way we approach ritual evidence of our Aramaic incantation bowls and help us make sense of other extant late antique narrative texts. So when I encounter a Babylonian incantation in the first person feminine, I don't really need to prove to the reader that a woman wrote it. I don't need to prove that formulas deployed in it were meaningful. I think these are modern hangups and limitations. I think we can talk about ritual dictation and writing and recitation as public performances where the gender of the client and the audience mattered and was amplified by the scribe. So it's not enough to envision like the single professional scribe or the default male Jewish writer as producing a text. There's only collaborations of scribes with others who think of themselves as the subject. They think of themselves as writing with an audience around them. And some incantations, by the way, do feature groups of women seeking intervention as well. So we can stop erasing them from the evidence. So to turn actually really quickly from ritual text to books more broadly in my last minute here, I propose a kind of like Bechdel test for ancient texts that can tell us who is at the space of composition. Hopefully you know what the Bechdel test is. It started out as a comic strip. It's become kind of a tool in media studies. It simply asks, in any given movie, are there two named women who talk to each other about something other than a man? So it's just like a really quick test that denaturalizes the absence of women, but it also sets like a very low standard, right? It's not asking about age, race, or class. It doesn't even comment on the quality of representation, but it does gesture towards minimal amounts of inclusivity in the writing room. So when we read an ancient text, first, do you have two named women protagonists talking to each other? For example, the Book of Ruth. Second, in a text, do you have example of women assuming authority for themselves without consulting male authorities? For example, the Acts of Thecla. Thirdly, do you have explicit mention of groups of women in the audience or the community who support the protagonists? Fascinating, both the Book of Ruth and the Acts of Thecla have this. Right at the end of the Book of Ruth, women name Ruth's newborn. In the Acts of Thecla, the women in the audience seeing Thecla's trials are repeatedly referenced. So I think such depictions of women's community are an acknowledgement of either who was in the writing room or who was in the community of transmission, who was the initial audience of the story. It does not mean we have unmediated voices from the past, but it does gesture towards unusual gendered dynamics and compositional environments. And if you don't have any of these factors, that's when you can point to more hierarchical or exclusive gendered scribal rooms. So the absence of a community of transmission. But I think to get away from the lone genius, male, scribe, thinker, practitioner is a more accurate history and offers a more accurate assessment of the gendered compositional cultures of antiquity. I can add more examples in the discussion, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions.
Thank you very much, Mika. This was super interesting, really. Thank you so much.
So,
Clap, clap, clap on behalf of all of us. Okay, the order is that we just have the 4 papers now and the 4 presentations, and then we have the question and answer. So my job is then to introduce the next speaker, which is Esther Brownsmith, and her title is That's What She Said: Gendering, Authorship, and the Hebrew Bible. Esther, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. So thank you so much for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, Mika, for that wonderful paper. I'm looking at actually many of the same questions, so hopefully this will be an interesting contribution as well. So I'd like to talk about gendering authorship. And I got interested in this topic because I'm working on biblical research, and it would be a lot more interesting if I could show that the book's author that I'm working on was a woman. And indeed, people have claimed female authorship for many books of the Hebrew Bible. So I wanted to spend some time digging into a meta-analysis of those claims, and I hope you'll enjoy seeing the results. But as you can guess from the fact that even my opening picture only features scribes of, quote, indeterminate gender, those results aren't entirely in the direction that I expected. So to start off, the Bible itself attributes a number of texts to women, though not any complete books. These include speeches, songs, prayers, and proverbs. But of course, for critical scholars, attribution itself is insufficient. So I turned to modern scholarship and some of the claims that it's made. I began by surveying attempts to claim female authorship, which actually stretch back almost a century. And rather than list them all, I want to use 3 recent arguments as paradigmatic examples of the main 3 stances that scholars have taken. So to begin, several authors have made the positivist claim that female authorship is likely for various texts based on the contents of those texts. So Milgram's 2007 book exemplified this. He argued that, quote, only a woman would have thought of making a woman the pivot of the book of Esther. Now, these arguments are surprisingly widespread given their essentialist nature. They rest on the idea that certain subjects are fundamentally uninteresting to men, or that men are incapable of writing about certain topics. I call this an essentialist stance, and I hope I don't have to spell out why its assumptions are flawed. Men can and do convincingly write about women's lives. The second argument is a little more nuanced. It argues that cultures position men and women differently, such that certain genres or styles of language are strongly associated with only one gender. So Lee's 2015 book about female prophetic speech is an example of this direction. She argues that she can isolate a particular syllabic pattern in poetic texts that was used primarily by women. So whenever we see that pattern, we can postulate a woman author. I call this a cultural stance. And there are indeed anthropological studies that show societies in which male and female compositions take very distinct forms. But in order for this theory to work with the Bible, we need evidence that ancient Israel was one of those societies, and we would need to distinguish somehow between female authors and male authors using a female register for rhetorical purposes. So despite Lee's valiant effort, I am unpersuaded on both counts. The final argument is exemplified by a 2016 paper that I found it very easy to dismiss initially. Bledstein argues that not only was a woman the author of the J Pentateuchal source and the court history and Song of Songs, but that the woman can be identified as Tamar, David's daughter, and that we can even identify her lover. Now, clearly there are profound and numerous problems with taking this as a historical critical claim. But eventually I realized that Bledstein is serious when she calls this claim an assumption, something that cannot be proven, something brought in by the observer. So I call this approach an imaginative stance. Instead of claiming positivistically that we can prove the Bible's authorship, it invites the reader to engage in a speculative game of what if. All that said, the classic text in this field of female authorship is one that I haven't mentioned yet. Brenner and Van Dyke Henna's game-changing book on gendering texts, Female and Male Voices in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the authors describe how they initially hoped to find female biblical authors, but that they ultimately realized they had to change their goalpost. Instead of looking for texts written by women or attributed to women, they could find texts that expressed women's voices. These women's voices reflected echoes of real female speech and viewpoints, but they were necessarily mediated by their redaction into the biblical text. Brenner and Van Dyke Henna's thus presented a compromise that would be extremely influential for the next 20 plus years. Unfortunately, even this attempt received some deep critiques, many of them from the author Brenner herself. 10 years later, she criticized the, quote, positively triumphant diagnosis of either female or male voices in the text, arguing that it reflected the reader's ideology rather than something inherent in the texts. A more recent critique came from Tamara Rosenau via the methodology of queer studies. She points out that their technique reifies gender stereotypes and relies on a gender binary that science and anthropology no longer believe exists. Gender is constructed, as Tamara Rosenau notes, and we should focus on that construction as the performance that it is, not as a reflection of something innate in the authors. So where does all this leave us? As I studied the back and forth arguments on these subjects, I realized that part of the problem was that scholars were trying to answer three distinct questions with each other. And it's convenient when two problems can solve each other, but this isn't one of those cases. So the first question is historical critical. Who wrote the texts of the Bible? The second question is literary. How does gender influence how we read biblical texts? And the third question is ideological. How can we build a narrative of the past that restores marginalized genders? And if I have one main point, it's this. These are three questions that cannot be conflated with each other. They come from distinct places and they inspire distinct answers. And so in the minutes I have remaining, I'd like to reflect briefly on each. First, who wrote the books of the Bible? I think a useful model here is the quantum model of indeterminacy. That is, that some things are impossible to know precisely, but that they can be defined in terms of probabilities. And although our data is limited, we can do that kind of work on this question. So for instance, Nissen looked at the gender of named prophets in various ancient Near Eastern archives and found that 2/3 of the Mari prophets were male, but 2/3 of the Assyrian prophets were female. So that means if you have an anonymous Mari prophecy, you can simply say that it was likely, but not certainly, written by a man. And to reflect that uncertainty, you might say they said, rather than he said. And note something else. Both the Mari and the Assyrian clusters included prophets who didn't conform fully to either male or female genders. So if we're looking to them for data about biblical prophecy, then we have to note that a given prophecy could have been uttered by a man or a woman or neither. Second, how does gender influence how we read biblical texts? The answers, of course, are myriad. Gender may be constructed, but it had a real and broad influence on how people lived and wrote. So it's an extremely useful lens as long as we remember that it's just a lens. And Tamara Rosenau articulates this really well. When a biblical text strikes the scholar as feminine, the scholar should look at what such femininity does for the text. Why might an author of whatever gender have chosen this voice? What purpose does gendered language serve in a text? And so in this way, the search for gender and voice can open up all sorts of literary horizons. And finally, how can we build a narrative of the past that restores marginalized genders? And I'll note that I'm using restore here in two different senses. Both the quest to flesh out our history so it encompasses more than just men, and the quest to revive and nourish people who are used to reading about a past that doesn't include them. I'll also note that by marginalized genders, I mean everyone except cisgender men, so women, trans people of all genders, and non-binary or agender people. Now, the good news is that biblical studies is not the only field struggling with this question. Other fields like subaltern studies, African diaspora studies, and queer studies have grappled with archives that ignore or distort the voices of the past. So one possibility developed by Saidia Hartman is called critical fabulation, but it actually bears a close resemblance to what we might call midrash or even fan fiction. Critical fabulation is about, quote, fashioning a narrative that tells an impossible story, one that couldn't be told based on concrete evidence alone. This corresponds to the imaginative approach that I mentioned earlier. It takes the fragments and scraps and pointed omissions around marginalized genders, and it creates a plausible but unprovable story that allows us to see our own humanity in the past. A final possibility is realigning our search. And I was really struck by a quotation by one scholar of American slavery, that when we focus on autobiographic narratives, we let an archive of slavery metonymically stand in for the archive of slavery. This struck me because I realized that we absolutely do the same when we focus on women in the Bible. We're binding ourselves to a specific and male-dominated set of writings and treating it like the only archive. Moreover, in searching for authors, as Mika explained so beautifully, we're imposing a modern construct of textual ownership, when ancient text production often involved a variety of input forms. But the fact is that when we look more broadly at the ancient Near Eastern archive, it's filled with women, poets and prophets, scientists and scribes, and much more. These women may not have written the biblical text, but their writings help to restore our view of the biblical world as a place populated by all genders. And in my final few moments, I'd like to introduce you to a few women through their own words. In the 7th century BCE, a woman named Amat Bal left this votive offering to the goddess Ashtoreth. The ivory box is beautifully carved, and on it, Amat Bal asked the goddess to bless her in her days. In the 18th century BCE, Shibtu was the queen of Mari in modern Syria. She wrote many letters, including this letter to her husband, in which she recounted a prophecy by a person named Shelabum, an Asinu, or gender nonconforming priest. Shibtu reassured her husband that the palace was well, then passed along the goddess's prophecy. As for the men who test you, I will place those men in your hand. And finally, Pudukhepa was a Hittite queen from the 15th century BCE. She ruled from Hattusa in modern Turkey. Pudukhepa corresponded frequently with other rulers, both male and female, and she also wrote a beautiful prayer to the goddess Arina. I, Pudukhepa, am your longtime servant, a calf of your stable, a cornerstone of your foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. Great. Thank you so much. Ooh, let's move on. Let's continue. I'll introduce Elizabeth Castelli, and her title is An Unpronounced Relief, Perduring Metaphor and Medieval Overwriting. Some Thoughts on Gendered Books and Reading Cultures. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and I'm already seeing connections from Mika and Esther's comments and my own. When I started planning my comments for today, I found myself reflecting, first of all, on the overarching theme of this project, books known only by their titles. Lost or destroyed books, books out of reach, closed books, unreadable books, imaginary books, books that were never written. All of these different varieties of books that cannot be read serve, in my view, as a broad and Borgesian metaphor for gendered histories of ancient and medieval writing and reading. And so to this conversation, I'm bringing three brief exemplars: an unprovenanced object, a perduring metaphor, and the idea of medieval overwriting. So first, an unprovenanced object. This is a gravestone relief that bears an image of a young girl seated on a stool. She holds on her lap a pair of wax tablets. In front of her, a book stand holds two scrolls, and behind her, a dog perches, seeking her attention. The Greek inscription below the image reads, Abeta, lived 10 years, 2 months, farewell. The girl's hairstyle, in the manner of the Empress Julia Domna, inspires scholars to date the relief to the Roman imperial period. One scholar says that it is probably from Athens, but then offers no argument or evidence to support that claim. Henri Marou includes the object in his 1938 history of representations of intellectual life in Roman sculpture, cataloging it under the general category, scenes of writing. The relief was part of a collection sold to the British Museum in 1805 upon the death of its most recent private owner, Charles Townley. Townley, meanwhile, had purchased the object along with a number of other reliefs and inscriptions and sculptures from the collection of Topfam Beauclerk upon his death in 1780, according to an agent's notes in the sale catalog, for £2, 12 shillings and 6 pence. Beauclerk had inherited the relief along with quite a number of other antiquities as a young child upon the death in 1744 of his father, Sidney, who had been the protege and heir of Richard Topfam, a well-positioned collector of books and antiquities, who had died in 1730. Between the time Charles Townley bought the relief in 1780 and his heir sold it to the British Museum in 1805, it was reportedly displayed on the chimney piece either, again, the records of the British Museum here conflict, either in the street parlor or the dressing room of Townley's house in Westminster. And I just want to share with you this picture, a painting of his library that gives you a little bit of a sense of how he lived with his antiquities. David Noy, a historian of the Topfam and Beauclerk collections, characterizes this display of my unprovenanced object by observing that, quote, the arrangements appear to have been based on size rather than any thematic logic, which is testified to also by this painting. The relief now resides in one of the cavernous storerooms in the British Museum, cataloged and warehoused out of view. I have many questions about this object. Who was Abeta? Why was she remembered after her death with an image that portrays her writing? Where was she buried? How did her gravestone come to be separated from her burial place? And by what transactions among adventurers, amateur or professional archaeologists, plunderers or thieves, antiquities dealers of good reputation or ill repute, did it find its way into the collection of Richard Topfam, the early 18th century MP for New Windsor and the keeper of the records of the Tower of London in the early 18th century? Of whom is Abeta representative? Who might she have been, this young girl remembered as practicing her letters, had she not died at 10 years and 2 months old? As my very brief history of the transfer of this object from one modern owner to another suggests, we know far more about the wealthy 18th century British men who variously owned this gravestone, men with habits for collecting books and drawings and Greco-Roman artifacts, bequeathing their collections to heirs who replenished their coffers by selling the collections to other collectors or eventually to the British Museum, erasing context and effacing provenance and obliterating meaning in the process. Now, I realize I'm projecting a lot onto the figure of Abeta here. It's a long way from this single weathered relief of an elite girl with an empress's hairstyle, learning her letters on a wax tablet, to anything approximating a full-blown account of women's literary activity in antiquity. But I want to linger on this image, its suggestiveness, its openness to interpretation, and even the desire it inspires in me as a viewer. I want to think about the object, beginning with its first purpose and its now obscured original setting in the Roman imperial period, all the way down through to its early modern removal from the girl's grave and delivery into the hands of various collectors, its installation in a Westminster gentleman's parlor or dressing room, and its interment in the basement storeroom of a national imperial museum. I want to sit with the loss of its context, its resonance, and its rootedness in the short life of a Roman period girl remembered as one who wrote. As a broad metaphor for the loss we seek to repair in writing gendered histories of books known only by titles, the gravestone of Abeta carries us some distance. And I'm going to make her go away. Okay. Example number 2. In the third homily of the Annunciation of the Holy Virgin Mary, spuriously attributed to Gregory Thaumaturgus, the speaker engages in some intertextual exegesis to gloss the story of the Annunciation from the Gospel of Luke. He preaches, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph. Hear what the prophet says about this man and the virgin. He quotes here Isaiah 29:11. This book that is sealed will be delivered to the man that is learned. What is meant by this sealed book? But just the virgin undefiled. This was announced by the prophet long before when he said, this book that is sealed shall be delivered to a man that is learned. And that man will say, I cannot read it. Why can you not read it, O Joseph? I cannot read it, he says, because the book is sealed. So here, glossing Luke 1:26-27 through a quotation of Isaiah 29:11, the homilist reads the virgin body of Mary as a sealed book. A sealed book is, of course, an unreadable book, a book known, as it were, only by its title. What might we make of this homiletic improvisation, which makes the singular and paradoxical and gendered body of Mary, virgin and mother, into a book that cannot be read? One might dismiss this example if it were itself unique, but as medievalist Catherine Keene has documented in a recent article about medieval women's literary patronage, Pseudo-Gregory's homily is but one of numerous examples from late antique and the early medieval periods when Christian writers portray Mary, the mother of Jesus, as the embodiment of a book. Ephraim the Syrian calls Mary a sealed book which is filled with secrets and is undecipherable by mortals. A homily spuriously attributed to Epiphanius of Salamis calls her the incomprehensible book. A homily spuriously attributed to John Chrysostom repeats Pseudo-Gregory's identification of Mary with the sealed book of Isaiah. And there are many other examples that she collects. If two or more is a pattern, then we indeed have a pattern, if not a full-on tradition, of figurations of Mary herself as a book known only by title. It is far beyond the scope here to flesh out this pattern or tradition, or to consider how it might intersect with a related tradition of late ancient and medieval references to and representations of the Annunciation, which depict Mary not as a book, but as a reader. Suffice for now to note the repetition of the metaphor of Mary as a closed or incomprehensible book, a paradox, I would argue, of it for a tradition that figures her as the bearer of the incarnate Word of God. Example number 3 is neither an object nor a widespread metaphor, but a recent scholarly intervention. The notion of overwriting as a new frame for reconstructing the often inaccessible histories of women's writing in late antiquity and early medieval periods. The concept belongs to the medievalist Diane Watt, who introduces it in her 2020 book entitled Women, Writing and Religion in England and Beyond, 650 to 1100. I don't have the time here to rehearse all of Watt's arguments or evidence, but just briefly, she starts by observing that literary production in this period, as we know, was not a project of solitary originality, but a collective and collaborative process that involved many players, as Mika has already pointed out in her presentation, archivists and scribes, anthologists and compilers, commentators and translators, who sampled freely from oral and written sources. When it comes to particular genres, histories of religious communities, for example, hagiographies and more, Watt argues that the structures of patronage, production, and consumption made it almost certain that women's stories are part of that literary heritage and that they underwent processes of what she calls overwriting. And here's a quotation from her. Monastic writers, some of whom were writing specifically for female patrons, overwrote female authorities and women's texts in the sense that they rewrote women's narratives, replacing their oral and written accounts, the so-called underwriting, with new versions. Such overwriting was often intended to improve, modernize, and preserve earlier material rather than to destroy or censor it. And the underwriting may well have continued to circulate and be read for some considerable time afterwards. She goes on, I also use the concept of overwriting in a more metaphorical sense to describe the complex relationship between male authors and their female subjects and to capture the ways in which texts can attempt to control and circumscribe female autonomy, end quote. In the rest of the book, Watts works through a variety of examples. The ecclesiastical history of the Venerable Bede, for example, which overwrites women as authorities, even as it preserves in the work their presence in the double monasteries of Whitby, Ely, and Barking. Surviving works by women, letters by women to Boniface, for example, or saints' lives that are either explicitly attributed to women authors or declared anonymous. We'll recall Virginia Woolf's canonical comment that anonymous for many centuries was a woman. And also Watts discussed works circulating in a slightly later period around the figure of Christina and Markyate and others. So this idea of overwriting is one I want to lift up as a potentially productive one, as a concept that insists that we keep what is written underneath always in mind. Overwriting might be, I suggest, a productive iteration of what Kim Heinz-Eitzen called the gendered palimpsest in a book that she published a decade ago. So I offer these 3 extremely briefly sketched exemplars as suggestive frames for our conversation. As we pursue a project of tracking and analyzing books known only by title and try to answer the accompanying questions of authorship, reception, interpretation, and transmission, I hope we can keep all of these haunting, unreadable and unreachable books, the unwritten books of Abeta, the the sealed book of Mary's body, and the overwritten works and auctoritas of early medieval women monastics, ever close to the center of the story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Great. Really, thank you so much. Wow, this is going great. I love all the papers so far. Ismo, I'm going to introduce you now. And the title of Ismo's presentation, it's Textual Experts and Textual Competence in John's Gospel. Ismo, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello everyone. It would be good to see you all, but it's not impossible. It's not possible now, right now. I'm afraid that my paper doesn't touch so much on the point of gendered practices, but I try to say something about literary cultures. Here is my outline of my paper. I will have something like 2 minutes per one item here, and I start at once. The set of 4 early Christian writings designated as Johanna literature presupposes a textual community of some kind. These texts were written by more than one person, and yet, despite their individual nuances, they have much in common in terms of style and theological affirmations. There was also a network of people in which these texts were exchanged and used to address communal disputes and doctrinal matters. The 2 aspects were certainly entangled. While it remains unclear over what the author of 3rd John and his opponent Diotrephes disagreed, the conflict between them was related to something the author had written earlier to the group led by Diotrephes. The disagreement over this one text must have been a serious one, since the author's emissaries were denied access to Diotrephes' group as a result, and the author had to compose the text we know as 3rd John for the purpose of damage control. Policies of inclusion and exclusion were not only protested, but also set by means of text. This much we can learn from 2 John, which was written to warn of deceivers promoting wrong opinions about Christ. The author urges the recipients to adopt the doctrinal test for those seeking entry to their homes. The contours of the right understanding of Christ are more fully elaborated in 1 John, and of course in the full-blown narrative account of Jesus in John's Gospel. Both texts pay special emphasis on their writtenness. Most importantly, the otherwise unknown beloved disciple of Jesus is introduced in the Gospel not only as a key witness and reliable source of information, but as a scribe who wrote the whole story. There are signs of some interest in other texts, in Johannine texts. The Hebrew Bible clearly plays a significant role in the Gospel. Christ is proclaimed as one whom Moses, the law of Moses, and the prophets wrote about. The author often quotes the Hebrew Bible, and themes related to its interpretations are addressed in the dialogues between Jesus and the Jews. Some or all the synoptic Gospels may have been used when the Gospel was composed, although they are never directly referred to in John's Gospel. There is no lack of links proposed between John's Gospel and various forms of ancient literature: biography, romance, tragedy, parentic literature, Platonic dialogues, Hermetic dialogues, Midrash, testaments of patriarchs, etc., etc. Yet critical sifting may still be needed at this front. It certainly required some advanced level literacy, reading, and skill in composition to write the Gospel. If all suggestions are taken with equal force, however, cultural knowledge assumed for the author of John's Gospel coincides with almost the full spectrum of the ancient literature known to us. Recent studies on what is designated sociology of reading in antiquity remind us that groups of literate people were of vital importance to production and circulation of books. The path from drafts to publication was strikingly similar to that in modern academia. Pliny the Younger described the process in detail. He first presented parts of his work in progress to only a few people and provided some with a written version. Then he edited the work in light of the comments he received, and the entire work was then recited in front of a group, and yet another round of revisions ensued. All readings took place in private meetings of close friends whose literary tastes Pliny appreciated and trusted. It also depended on this group whether the work proceeded to publication. For publishing took place only if one's literate friends wanted to issue for themselves copies of the work, which then could be recited in front of other audiences. The circle of such literary-minded people functioned as gatekeepers of literary taste and promoters of new players in the field. Pliny's literary circle was most likely words apart from the circle behind the Johannine texts. Nevertheless, Pliny's account delineates some general conditions of textual production in antiquity that were most likely operative also in the Johannine group. We can't tell what kinds of editorial processing went into the Johannine texts, but we can assume that a great deal of social activity was involved in their production, copying and promotion to other people. There must have been people who had leisure for and competence in such literary pursuits. Against this background, it's intriguing to take a look at how textual experts and textual competence are portrayed in the Johannine texts, especially in John's Gospel. Can we glean from these portrayals some more precise information of the Johannine group as a textual community? Does the Gospel reflect the ways the group discussed about texts, or does it offer models of how such discussion should be conducted? Does the Gospel hint at competing interpretations of scriptures inside or outside the group? And if it does, how are disagreements dealt with? As points of comparison, I have in mind two imagined communities of the learned, both of which are one way or another hypertextual. One is Philos Therapeuti, whose all activities revolve around texts, intensive study of the texts of the old men, composition of hymns and psalms to God, and weekly meetings where the member most advanced in age and knowledge delivered an authoritative exposition of scriptures. My other example is the community of learned people constructed in the Clementia attributed to Clement of Rome. This text might stem from the early 4th century, and it extends an invitation to Gentiles to a modified form of Judaism that involved certain lifestyle expectations such as menstrual separation, ritual bathing, avoidance of food offered to traditional deities, and withdrawal from a table fellowship with non-baptized Gentiles, yet no circumcision. Jesus and Moses, strikingly, are in the text regarded as two alternative and yet equal sources of divine instruction. The Clementia invests heavily in drawing a plausible picture of the two protagonists, Clement and the Apostle Peter's, and their debates with philosophers and heretics. One striking feature is how carefully the opponents' views are delineated in Clementia. Once Clement debates with one Appian over allegorical explanation of ancient myths, and when Appian does not show up to finish his argumentation, Clement does this for him, and only then mounts his own case against this reading of myths. The narrator also devotes much space to the opponent's arguments in describing the debates between Peter and Simon Magus. For instance, the narrator let Simon offer a lengthy list of scriptural passages to the effect that there are more than one God. What matters to the point I seek to make here is that both parties of the debates are portrayed as textual experts who show off their competence. This quality cuts across the borders. Not only is Clement able to finish his opponent's argument, but Simon, the arch-heretic, is also described as one who knows his Bible, though his conclusions are deemed as heresy. And here's the point which may be absolutely trivial I want to make here. A strikingly different intellectual landscape is painted in John's Gospel. It's true that the law of Moses is often mentioned and the subtle interpretations of it are sometimes developed. Yet 3 points need to be made. 1, scriptures are almost solely discussed in polemical contexts. The law of Moses is a recurrent theme only in Jesus' debates with his opponents. Interest in scriptures recede almost completely in the farewell discourse in which Jesus addresses the inner circle of his disciples. Only one quotation from the Hebrew Bible is featured in this long passage, which takes no less than 1/4 of the entire gospel. 2, some of Jesus' opponents are characterized by expertise in scriptural interpretation, but their textual competence is never put on display. Jesus affirms that his opponents, in John 5, explore the scriptures, and the Pharisees curse the hoi polloi for not knowing the law. 3, in the debates described in the first half of John's Gospel, it is always Jesus who argues scripturally, whereas his opponents usually call not upon texts, but rather upon ethnic traditions and practices. In those rare cases where the opponents do refer to scriptures, they usually do so in a generic manner. I won't go to this list in detail. I'm sure that most of you know John's Gospel by heart, unlike I do, so there is no need to go to this list. I only make a very brief conclusion. While the homilies, while the Clementia aim at the thick description of the opponent's views, John's is a quite thin one. The way the inner circle of Jesus' followers is envisioned in John's Gospel is also quite different from Philo's dream community of scholars solely devoted to texts. This may be of importance when we reflect on how textual the Johannine group was. Textual competence seems to have been of relative value. It didn't define the group identity constructed in the Johannine texts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismo. You take the shared screen away, Ismo, so we can see each other. Okay, thank you so much, all the 4 of you. Now, as Francis said at the beginning, it's possible to write your questions and comments in the Q&A. But while you think and write, I just want to open for comments, small comments, brief comments from the panelists. Anything you want to say to each other? Anything you see, the shared patterns, topics that overlap or something? You just want to start the conversation? Any of you? Mika? Yeah,
just a really brief comment to Elizabeth Castelli's talk. When you were talking about this portrayal of Mary as the embodiment of a book, it made me think about how the rabbis talk about the Torah as a seductive woman or seductive book. So it was just so interesting to hear about it in a different context. And so I wondered if part of the idea of portraying Mary as a book is explaining one's devotion to the monastic life or something.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know enough about this tradition to comment on it with authority, but I think it's, I mean, the part that I was just so struck by was the fact that it's the emphasis is on the sealedness of the book, which is of course saying something about her virginity, but it also means you can't read it. You can't get to the contents of it at all, which just seems to me to be the height of paradox. But I wanted to come back around to your presentation, Mika, because I think there were some really nice resonances between what you were talking about how ancient texts got written, right? Through speech, how they got read through hearing, how they were communal projects and so on. And I really think that point is a really important one for destabilizing a certain kind of received impression that writing has to involve a single author sitting down with the instruments of writing and producing a work, right? Which, we get tenure for, but it's not how it was done. And I think that the way that you framed it just sort of opened up to a really different and very generative way of thinking about what literary production might look like.
Yeah, Ismo?
I was actually thinking about the same point when I was listening to your paper, Mika, because you also addressed the whole phenomenon of how dictation relates to writing. And at the same time, actually, you mentioned that those people sometimes refer to dictation as writing. And it might be indicative of that it's not simply performance. And this basically what I have in mind is also the discussion people are now conducting as regards ancient Roman literary circles. And there is actually kind of something that would be kind of a return of the author to the field, because they kind of emphasize that although it was all emerging books were always kind of socially constructed in one way, and yet at the same time there was this distinction between who were the authors and who presented the work and who did the editing, and it in light of the comments. But it's kind of, they still, I mean, one thing we probably shouldn't do, what has been done much in biblical studies, that we can't think either that these documents we are dealing with are kind of written by a community. It's kind of community participated in the forms of feedback and things like that, but there still were things like what we have composition, and people were writing down, and they were reciting these texts. And even there is a kind of critical discussion about how much texts were really performed and what did it mean that texts were performed, because most of the accounts of the ways texts were performed seem to be kind of, they try to emphasize that no dramatic elements were added to readings and things like that. So they were a bit like academic reading of papers rather than some actor or read or reading a paper and kind of dramatizing the paper.
Thank you. I mean, this is brilliant. We could have continued with just you talking among yourself, but now I want to invite Francis. And is there any questions for us for the panel?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. We have several questions.
Oh,
the
good.
first comes from Rosie Wagner. Rosie says, "Wonderful talk, Dr. Brownsmith. Do you find any themes or consistencies in works where women speak with other women versus to the world at large, or to non-women genders?" So this is for Dr. Brownsmith.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and yet the answer that I'm leaning towards giving is actually no. And I will give a couple of examples to explain what I mean by that. One from the Bible and one not from the Bible. That to my knowledge, the only letter that we have from the ancient world that's written in Phoenician was preserved in parchment in Egypt, and it's actually between two sisters. And so they talk to each other, Arshed and Basha, And they have a good formulaic beginning where they bless each other to the gods. And then they say, let me receive the money which you sent me, give me a payment. So it's very much along the lines of many other letters that we have between men or between men and women, which are concerned with the daily economic lives of the people who are writing them. And then the other passage that came to mind was from the Bible, but actually is an example of something that may meet the Mika test. I don't know if we're going to call it that from now on. In that it is a text that is a woman talking to other women, and it's attributed to a woman, which is the end of Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, where you have the mother of Sisera talking to her women, and she's talking about how her son is going to come back with lots of spoil, including 1 or 2 wounds per soldier. And so it's this almost crass way of talking about women as the subject of captivity and rape and warfare. So I wish I mean, certainly you have counterexamples like the Book of Ruth, which has a lot of kind of tender familial love and concern over reproduction and family and heritage. But I think from what we can see of what women wrote in just regular writing to each other, it's a lot like what men wrote, which is the details of everyday life. That I don't know if there's a really deep qualitative difference, but I'd be very happy if one of the others wants to answer this as well.
Yeah, or we can go on to next question, because I think we have some on the list.
Yes, we do. So this one would be for Dr. Dunderberg. So in light of the presentations by Dr. Ahuvia, Dr. Brownsmith, and Dr. Castelli, can you address the issue of gender in relation to the Johannine textual community?
Ismo.
Yeah, sure. I think that basically the evidence probably goes to 2 ways, right? If we think that some women are mentioned in the Johannine story, and I was kind of actually thinking about Mika's tests as regards the Johannine story. There is the Samaritan woman and Martha and Mary of Magdalene, and all those are actually what I find interesting in one way is that these women who appear as Jesus' dialogue partners, they are treated as badly as everyone in the story. So they are treated equally. At the same time, I think that there is it might be symptomatic that when it comes to the favorable discussion, all the questions are posed by men. So it kind of the implication seems to be that only men are present there. And one big issue is whether, and this is because I should write a commentary on the Johannine epistles, can we translate all these references to the Adelphoi? Are these the brothers, or is this inclusive terminology? Should this denote brothers and sisters? Of course, if we take 2 John as denoting kind of, if we take that quite literally, the beloved church as the lady church, I think is the term used there. So there might be some possibility, but it's not. I don't have a very clear picture. What should we make of all these loose ends in regard to the textual or women in the textual community in the Johannine or behind the Johannine texts?
Yeah, shall we allow one more question, and then maybe you want to have some more conversation among the panel?
Sure. So that question was by Anna Rebecca Solovo, who is a fellow of ours. The next question comes from Jeremiah Coogan, and he says, thanks so much to Dr. Castelli for her wonderful paper. I wonder how she might connect the late ancient and medieval image of Mary as a sealed book with a parallel textual image of Mary as the most open and revisable book of book formats, the wax tablet. We see this in Eusebius, Pseudo-Epiphanius, Pseudo-Chrysostom, and others, especially since both sometimes appear in the writings of the same figures. How do you see these two divergent textual metaphors as interacting with and complicating one another?
That is a great question. And you're teaching me something about these additional metaphors that exist about Mary's body, which I didn't know. So I think I am not an expert on any of this material. But I will say that, I think that what's interesting is that we can have these competing metaphors that are working around a narration about Mary's body as either a sealed book or an open book, as a book that can be inscribed and re-inscribed repeatedly. Some of the other medieval examples that Catherine Keene raises include just kind of a proliferation of types of books that Mary's body embodies. And so I think that, what I want to say is I don't think that we need to harmonize all of these different metaphors, but just it's worth certainly at a first glance sort of taking note of the fact that these are the metaphors that are being used to talk about either in some sense her virginity, and other senses her role as the mother of Christ, and potentially the carrier of tradition more broadly, and so on. And it is suggesting to me that there's a really interesting research project to be done here that I have not yet done. So,
yeah, Mika, you wanted to answer that also?
Oh no, sorry, I'm just moderating as well. But I do think that the image of the sealed book, I wonder if that's also like the sealed or locked garden of Song of Songs. Is that when I look at like liturgical poetry, like often that image is used for women. So I wonder if that's playing a role there too.
Yeah. Now the panelists, is there things that the other panelists talked about that you would like to talk more about, hear more about, ask about? You see connections between the papers?
Could I say something? Esther, I wanted to thank you for your presentation, and especially at the end when you were offering us some models from other disciplines that might open things up, open the conversation up in some ways. And I was particularly struck by your quotation of Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation, and wonder if you might be willing to hazard a little experimental performance right now about what that might look like.
Esther, are you ready? Critical fabulation.
Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just interested in what that might look like, because I think it's really quite an interesting bringing together of what Saidiya is trying to accomplish in her work, and what there are different histories around enslaved populations from the past, and ancient peoples whose stories are full of lacuna, and so in some ways we're needing to invent. But I'm just interested in what you think that might look like for the kinds of texts that you're concerned about.
Wow, that's an excellent question, and one that I'm going to try and see if I can answer without any preparation. So one of the texts that I thought of using as an example at the end, but didn't, was a adoption contract between two women. It's a Old Babylonian contract between Pirutum and Belisunu, where Pirutum is being adopted as a daughter and a bride-to-be by this other woman. And one of the interesting things about the adoption is that the scribe is a woman as well, and almost all the witnesses are women. And so I love imagining, kind of in line with this critical fabulation, just this community of women coming together and watching this adoption of one woman by another, and even writing it down themselves and documenting it in that way, and putting it in clay as something to be remembered. That it's this very mundane event, but through the gender dynamics of who's there, you can, and through imagination, you can imagine it being this coming together of community and this moment of blessing and excitement and something beautiful and new starting between these two women. So that's an example of, you know, all we have is this adoption contract, and it's not like the adoption contract includes any flowery language, but we can kind of guess a little based on the few details that we do have of the past, what we can imagine as being there. That said, one of the things that I'm still working on is figuring out kind of what are the differences between critical fabulation and midrash, which of course happens both in antiquity, but also in the modern world. There's a very rich flood of midrash being written by women in particular about biblical characters and non-biblical characters, and also fan fiction, which is an area that I'm researching in. And so these feel like different lenses on this same kind of question of how do you take the past and build on it in a way that is recognizing that you can never quite get there, that you can never quite bring life to these people who are dead, but that we can still bring life to the people who are alive now.
Oh, thank you, Esther. Francis, we have a question.
Yes, we have a question from Julia Lindenlaub, and she says, many thanks to all presenters for a great session. I have a question for Dr. Dunderberg. I'm very interested in your discussion of textual experts in John's Gospel. Would you consider the disciples at chapter 2:22 and chapter 12:16, and particularly the beloved disciple at chapter 19:35 through 37, to be presented as positive models of textual experts in John?
Yeah, I think that's of course a possible way to understand these figures. It's still quite interesting to hold Johannine hermeneutics, that it really makes that kind of almost Bultmannian distinction between what took place before the resurrection and how things were understood after the resurrection. So the disciples didn't actually get it when it's kind of interesting juxtaposition, because there is so much emphasis on the fact that these disciples were the eyewitnesses, and then it's at the same time emphasized that they understood only later. So, but I think that they are in a way presented as potential textual experts, and perhaps one could take that as an invitation to a community to occupy themselves with textual studies as well, kind of attempts to learn. But John, when it comes to that kind of thing, whether the author really encouraged the group to study scriptures, we don't have much in terms of those kind of invitations. It doesn't seem to be a first priority in John. So it's kind of a marginal issue, and especially in the Johannine epistles, we don't have any references to the Hebrew Bible in 2nd and 3rd John, and we have only one allusion to the Hebrew Bible in 1st John. So it doesn't really kind of suggest that this group was really intensely working with Old Testament or Hebrew Bibles interpretation. I don't know whether Marianne would agree with that. That's
I think we could start a new discussion here, but my task, is to somehow schedule the time, and we are actually a couple of minutes over because this was so super interesting. So I forgot to look at my watch. I'm so sorry, but anyway. So my task now is to thank all of you, especially the panel. Thank you so much for a very interesting session with so many perspectives that we could have picked up on so much things, but this is just to start the conversation, I think. And I would like to say also thank you to all those who attended, the audience from everywhere around the world, and also to Francis for helping off with the questions and everything. And my last task is to invite you also to the next webinar in this series, which will happen on the 7th of April at the same time. And then the topic is absent books, lost, burned, dumped. So as you see, very interesting topics coming up also the next month. So for now, thank you and have a great evening, morning, night, whatever you want around. And thank you so much, all of you. Bye-bye from Oslo.